Good afternoon. Today I would like to talk about the fairness of the tariffs imposed by U.S. administration on the developing and the poorer countries. I would like to take the views of a global justice thinker called Darrell Mollendorf, based on a paper that he had written called the WTO and Egalitarian Justice. Firstly, I would like to put out the rationale behind the imposition of high tariffs that the US administration had put out. So, there are four main points that the US administration had put out. And for each of these points, I'll present the view of the global justice thinker called Darrell Mollendorf. So firstly, let me just right away tell you the rationale behind the high tariffs according to the US administration. So the first point, the first reason that the US administration gives is behind the imposition of high tariffs is reducing the trade deficit between US and another country. That is to balance trade between US and another country. In this case, I would like to take the example of a developing country. So let me illustrate the point using the example of the developing country Vietnam. Vietnam, US has a trade deficit of over $116 billion with Vietnam as of 2022. And basically, Vietnam actually exports labor intensive goods like textiles, footwear, and electronics. So such kind of labor intensive goods, and there are reasons for why they do that, because they do it cheaply because of the cheap labor that is produced. So basically, if a U.S. administration imposes a high tariff on such goods, according to the global justice thinker Darrell Mollendorf, it would be unfair on Vietnam. Basically, way back in during the first term of Donald Trump actually wanted to escalate the tariffs, and he had threatened to escalate tariffs on the goods from Vietnam. And this would be unfair based on the view of Darrell Mollendorf, based on his paper, the WTO and Egalitarian Justice, because it would either cause a reduction in the exports to US in these exports of these labor intensive goods, or it would make these goods not so competitive, less competitive than before in the US markets. And this is bad because Vietnam relies a lot on the market access from foreign countries for sustaining and maintaining its economy. And what Mollendorf would say is there would be a disproportionate effect on the economy of Vietnam compared to what US would have as a benefit in the form of reduction of a trade deficit if it were to impose a high tariff. That is one point. The second point is, if a developing economy like Vietnam would have to bear the brunt of high tariffs, and then, as I told you, it would lead to a possible marginalization of the economy, and because of that, there would be large scale. There is a possibility of a large-scale poverty in the country. There is a possibility that a lot of people could descend into poverty because of unemployment that would be generated due to the loss that these reduction in the exports or reduction in the competitiveness of these goods would cause due to the high tariffs. So basically, this would be unfair because there is already inequality between Vietnam and US. And I'll give you some data. There is, in 2023, Vietnam had a per capita income of $4,300 and that of US was $76,000. There is already inequality between US and Vietnam. So imposition of tariffs and ensuring that and causing a lot of poverty in the country, causing a lot of people to lose employment, would further perpetuate the inequality between Vietnam and US. And therefore, according to Darrell Mollendorf, it would be imposition of high tariff on Vietnam would be unfair. In 2025, you have seen that high tariffs are imposed on Vietnam already a few days back. So what would Mollendorf suggest a solution for this kind of injustice to a developing country like Vietnam and many other developing countries? So Mollendorf would say that developed countries have a responsibility to integrate poorer and developing countries into global trade, especially because they were a victim of economic injustices. Some of them at least are a victim of economic disadvantages, historical economic disadvantages. And the developed countries have a responsibility to integrate these countries into global trade in this context. The developed countries, by imposing high tariffs, should not punish the developmental efforts of these developing or the poorer countries, and therefore the imposition of high tariffs, because it leads to a divide between the poor and the rich, because it perpetuates the already existing divide between the poor and the rich. The imposition of high tariffs on developing and poor countries like Vietnam is unfair. So, as I've already told you the point that the economy of Vietnam would be negatively affected and it would have a disproportionate effect on Vietnam compared to the benefits that US would have. And this brings me to another point that the US administration had put down for the rationale behind the tariffs. And this has got to do with boosting the domestic revenue of US. So here I would like to take the example of another developing country, Bangladesh, and how it would be impacted by high tariffs due to the reason of boosting the domestic economy of US. So firstly, Bangladesh exports a lot of apparel to US, and it's a major exporter of apparel to US. It relies on the market access of foreign countries like US to sustain and maintain its economy through the export of these apparel. 80% of all the exports of Bangladesh are the export of apparel. So it is very clear that imposition of tariffs on Bangladesh would be a vulnerability for the economy of Bangladesh. So for the reason of boosting domestic revenues, imposition of these tariffs, according to Darrell Mollendorf, would be unfair. So the reason is when one wants to finance the domestic revenues using the money gained out of tariffs, it is effectively like shifting the burden of taxation from the citizens of US to poorer and developing countries. Would that be unfair according to you? Would that be fair according to you? Rather than putting the burden on citizens of US or the citizens of other developed countries rather than poorer or developing countries, would it be fair to shift the burden of taxation to poorer and developing countries? It clearly feels that it's not fair at all. It is some kind of a regressive taxation where the tax is imposed on poorer and developing countries to finance the domestic revenues. So So this is one reason why it would be unfair, and according to Mollendorf, that trying to finance domestic revenues through tariffs would be unfair, and it becomes more striking when one gets to know that US has a preferential trade agreement with with some of the developed countries of EU where the tariff is close to zero. So the unfairness becomes more striking when one gets to understand this particular point. Bangladesh in 2021, if you were to make the understanding of how much, if you want to get an understanding of, get a flavor of how much US takes from Bangladesh, as of 2021, the amount of money taken in the form of tariffs to buy US and Bangladeshi goods were $900 billion. That's for 1 year, and that too from a developing country. So Mollendorf would once again, as a solution, would suggest that developed countries have a responsibility towards developing countries in ensuring, or the poorer countries in ensuring, that these countries integrate well with the global trade, rather than imposing high tariffs and punishing their developmental efforts. Like in the case of Bangladesh and Vietnam, they have a responsibility to reduce the gap between poorer and the richer countries, which is already existent in the world. So far we have talked about two rationales put out by the US administration behind imposition of high tariffs. One is to balance trade with other countries, and the second is to boost domestic revenues. And you have already seen how it is different, how it is unfair, according to Darren Mollendorf, to impose high tariffs on these grounds. Now let me come to the third point. I told you there are 4 points that are put out by the US administration. I'll come to the third point, and third point has to do something with market access. US wants to impose high tariffs because it wants to pressurize the other country to reduce its own tariffs, so that US gets a better market access to the other country. And this is called imposition of reciprocal tariffs. Because another country has a high tariffs, a developing country has high tariffs for the goods of US. US also wants to, a developed country like US also wants to impose an equal amount of tariffs. Is this fair? According to you, is this fair? According to Darrell Mollendorf, it's not fair. It's not fair because he says that developed countries, in their path towards development, in the initial stages of their development, have historically protected their infant industries, and now they deny the same privilege. They try to deny the same privilege to the developing countries, a crucial tool for the development of a nation. They deny it. Is that fair? Mollendorf would say no. Here I would like to take the example of India. In 2018, US imposed a 10% tariff on the import of steel, for import of aluminium from India, a 25% of tariff for the import of steel from India. Not only India, but also many other countries. Because of this, India lost a lot for especially in if you were to take only steel. The exports of steel from India had come down by 50% after the import of these, after the imposition of these tariffs. So these tariffs were imposed in 2018, and if you were to specifically look at the revenues that India received in 2017 for the import or the export of steel to America, it was $372 billion, and that reduced to $171 billion in 2019. So there was a reduction in the export of steel after the imposition of 25% tariff on steel in 2018. So basically, developing countries like India would clearly lose out if there is high imposition of tariff. And Daryl Mollendorf would say that this privilege that the developed countries had, and this US had done because it increased the tariffs because it wanted to get better market access to India, because it expected India to reduce its own tariffs so that US would get a better market access. It expected India would be pressurized to reduce its own tariffs because of the high tariffs on steel and aluminum, so that US would get a better market access to India. So Mollendorf would say that if India got pressurized and reduced the tariffs, India would lose the privilege that the developed country like US had historically of having protected its own infant industries. And this is unfair, and this violates egalitarian justice. According to Mollendorf, as a suggestion would suggest that the developed countries should unilaterally reduce their tariffs and ensure and let the developing and the poor countries protect their own industries so that they grow. And that would be more fair than imposing high tariffs. And now, let me move on to the next point of what US administration had given a reason for high imposition of tariffs. This also has to do something with market access. If imposition of tariffs are based on if imposition of tariffs for getting market access to another country is unfair, then protecting or preventing another developing country, a poor country, to get market access in a developed country is also unfair. And the reason put out by the US administration for restricting or preventing access or trying to reduce access to the markets for the developing countries is safeguarding national security. So those domestic industries would be protected which pertain to national security, like defense, like energy security, like infrastructure. Now the question is this fair or is this unfair? Daryl Mollendorf comes out with a fact about such kind of situations. He says that low technology countries lose out $700 billion every year because of developed world protectionism. So what do you think that he says? He thinks that it's unfair and admits the already existing inequality where 1% of the rich have as much income as 57% of the poor people in the country. There is already inequality existing in the world. Would one want to perpetuate that inequality by imposing high tariffs on the grounds of national security? No, Darren Mollendorf would say no. So preventing market access for developing countries by imposition of tariffs on the grounds of national security is a big no-no for Mollendorf. In the case of India, you've already seen how this inequality would be perpetuated, where there was a drop in the exports of 50% by about 50% after the imposition of tariffs in 2018. Mollendorf would rather say that it would be better that the developed countries try to reduce the inequality in the world than to protect their own security, because if they do that, then there would be mutual prosperity in the world, and that would reduce the need for global security or national security in itself. So if the root cause is solved, then the other reasons will fall into place. Darrell Mullendorf would also say that using national security to impose high tariffs should be something that needs to be done as a last resort, but the developed countries abuse it too much, and therefore they should not. So now let me move on to the fourth point. I've already given you 3 points that the US administration had given out to impose high tariffs, and I've given you the views of Darrell Mullendorf based on his paper WTO and Egalitarian Justice, what he thinks about these reasons for the imposition of high tariffs. Let me go on to another aspect of fourth point, and it also has to do with national security. It has to do with prevention of illegal immigration and drug trafficking. Here I would like to take the example of Mexico. Mexico is a country that relies highly on the market access of US. 80% of its exports go to US. And if US imposes a high tariff on Mexico, there would be a loss of billions of dollars for Mexico. It would possibly be marginalized as an economy. In 2019, Trump threatened to impose high tariffs on Mexico on the grounds of protecting national security, on the grounds of pressurizing Mexico to crack down on illegal immigration from Mexico, cracking down on drug trafficking. Is this a fair way of dealing with a political issue like drug trafficking and illegal immigration? Darrell Mullendorf would say no. Developed countries should not economically blackmail developing or poor countries into extracting political decisions. This is what Mullendorf would say. And it would be coercive if the developed countries do something like that. This would be ethically unacceptable if developed countries do something like that, even while the developing or the poorer country is visibly vulnerable to these tariffs. In the case of Mexico, not only would the inequality between Mexico and US be perpetuated because of high tariffs, but also the problem of immigration would not be reduced, because there will be a large number of people who would descend to poverty, and then they would like to flee from a drowning economy. Would it be easy for Mexico to crack down on illegal immigration? Would it be easy for US to stop illegal immigration? It would become more difficult. So imposition of high tariffs rather than safeguarding national security would only worsen the issue of national security pertaining to illegal immigration and drug trafficking, according to Mullendorf. So basically, what Mullendorf would suggest now is it's better that rather than using economic tools to extract political decisions, the matters of political decisions should be dealt with diplomatically. The relevant countries should be brought to the table through the multilateral institutions like WTO, and they should not only be allowed to participate, but they should be actively involved in these meetings by empowering them to formulate and implement the new rules of these governing bodies. At present, that is not the case. At present, the developed countries hold clout in these multilateral governing bodies. The developed countries easily get away by economically blackmailing the poorer countries into trying to extract political decisions. Mullendorf gives a proof of this clout, fact about clout, through a fact. There are 29 least developed countries as a part of WTO, and only 12 have arrangements for a mission in Geneva to have a fruitful meeting in the WTO. So there are many small countries which don't even have any arrangement for representing themselves in WTO. So ultimately, once again, Moellendorff would say that imposition of high tariffs on the grounds of national security on developing and poorer countries is unfair. Unfair because it perpetuates inequalities. And Moellendorff thinks that developed countries have a responsibility to bridge the gap between themselves and developing or the poor countries. They have a responsibility to integrate the poorer and developing countries into global trade. Rather than doing that, imposing tariffs is only increasing the gap between rich and poorer countries, and therefore imposing high tariffs on these four grounds put out by U.S. administration is unfair. I hope you found this video on tariffs of U.S. administration interesting. Thank you.